So, over the last couple of years, I've spent quite a bit of time reading about non Western cultures, be it the Aztecs, the Ottomans, the Persians, the Arabs, the ancient Mesopotamian societies, and just trying to understand them as much as possible from kind of a non judgmental historical perspective. Now, I obviously have opinions on this. I think the Aztecs were a very brutal and savage culture, and I there's some I like more than others. Like, and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, I like the Achaemenid Empire quite a bit. And even in some ways, I like the Ottoman Empire. But the point is, I've been trying to look at them, kind of how they viewed themselves, and what the actual historical precedent was for them. And more than that, why they were the way they were. Because cultures don't just develop in a vacuum, they respond to specific stimuli, specific circumstances. People aren't stupid. They can be mistaken, they can be evil, they can have bad values, but these things often serve a purpose. So before I get into this, I just want to talk a bit about Orientalism. This is something I studied a bit back in university. And this was done by Edward Said, who is a Palestinian Christian, I believe. And he was highly critical of what he called Orientalism, which was the tendency of Westerners to romanticize and to kind of create this concept of the other. He viewed this as kind of a patronizing thing. It was the tendency of Westerners to see the East as being decadent or corrupt, or to be kind of the product of Victorian era literature and that kind of thing. Kind of romanticized, but also kind of infantilized. And to have this kind of idea of the Orient as being inherently different from the West. So I'm just going to read this little bit on Wikipedia and then we'll get into it, just because this was the best definition I found. Orientalism defined as the West, patronizing representations of the East, the societies and peoples who inhabit the places of Asia, North Africa, and the Middle East. According to Said, Orientalism, the Western scholarship about the Eastern world. Now, I find it interesting that he himself calls this the Eastern world. Like, he just groups this all together in the same way he claims Europeans do. But I digress. Is inexplicably tied to the imperialist societies who produced it, which makes much Orientalist work inherently political and servile to power. But to a certain extent, most historical narratives are like this. Like, if you look at the Chinese and the Japanese, they have specific words for people who aren't from their society. They call them gaijin or foreign devils or stuff like that. They had a view of Europeans as being barbaric. And to a certain extent, that was part of kind of how the shogunate or the emperors or later the nationalist Chinese and the communist Chinese tried to maintain their power and boost their regime by portraying the outside people as being greedy or imperialistic or capitalistic or whatever. That's not a uniquely Western thing. Westerners are just better at it because they developed mass media earlier. According to Said, in the Middle East, the social, economic, and cultural practices of the ruling Arab elites indicate they are imperial satraps who have internalized the romanticized Arab culture created by French, British, and later American Orientalists. The examples include critical analyses of the colonial literature of Joseph Conrad, which conflates a people, a time, and a place into a narrative of incident and adventure in an exotic land. Once again, this is something you have in pretty much every culture. The idea of these faraway places you don't know much about, being alien, having all these, like they used to have on the map, there be dragons, or here be dragons, I mean. This is a common thing in all peoples. There's this idea of Shambhala, or like the faraway land across the sea or something. This isn't just a Western thing, this is just a very common human thing. To kind of romanticize the unknown. Also, this is assuming that Arabs and Muslims didn't romanticize their own culture, which they did. They had their idea of the Islamic Golden Age when Muhammad led them. There were those who always regarded Like the Ottomans and the Mughals took a lot of aspects of what they considered to be Persian high culture, and they kind of viewed that as superior, and well, some of them did too, like more the kind of the primitive Arab backwaters. Some of the caliphates were very Arab centric and kind of de-emphasized the Islamic parts of it. This was kind of a thing that always existed. There's nothing particularly unique about this to the Western concept. The Westerners were just, at the time he was writing, better at it. Because, I mean, there's other eras where Persia ruled half the world, where Muslims had taken large portions of Europe, and I'm sure they had similar narratives. The critical application of post-structuralism and the scholarship of Orientalism influenced the development of literary theory, cultural criticism, and the field of Middle Eastern studies, especially regarding how academics practice their intellectual, post-colonial studies, yada yada. So, like, what are some examples of this kind of Orientalism thing? Things like harems, just the opulence with which sultans lived. There's this idea that in the East that monarchs and the upper class led these incredibly decadent lives, in contrast to the West, which they felt had always been at least somewhat more egalitarian, and even a lot of the more proud and more arrogant Western monarchs would never think of acting like how Oriental despots would act. Now, obviously, part of this is just simply the fact that Westerners, generally speaking, with rare exceptions, have never really practiced polygamy en masse. And that is kind of one of the key forms of what would generally be considered Oriental decadence. But there's always this kind of question is, where did this idea come from? And I guess kind of like in Said, in a lot of the kind of the post-colonial narrative, they will say, oh, this idea just came from the fact that Westerners are racist and imperialist. There was no real basis to this. But I think the question that he never seems to have asked, and maybe he did in his book, but I'm just going by what I learned about in school and what other people have said, is, was any of this a deliberate effort on the part of these so-called Oriental cultures to appear a certain way? And this idea hasn't really seemed to have ever been thought of. Cultures that the West thought were barbaric or violent or decadent or that kind of thing. Was any of this kind of a deliberate thing? And it's like that never really seemed to have occurred to them that this would be a deliberate policy. Because, I mean, and the truth is, wanting to be seen as a savage, brutal people is something a lot of cultures in history have wanted to have. Because psychological warfare is very important. Morale is very important. If you think your opponents are like cannibals and savages and they're going to torture and kill you if you lose to them, that scares people and that makes them fight less. It scares them. It makes them less organized. It makes them less likely to fight you. I mean, that's like what war paint is. That's why you like wear skulls around your neck. That's why like the Teutonic Knights, you always have the pictures of them with like the massive helms. I know that was mainly ornamental, but people like these big imposing things. People like to have the reputation. Like, let's look at pirates, for instance. Western pirates, like in the Caribbean, they like to have these like myths of how brutal and cruel they were because it encouraged people to surrender. So were the Aztecs kind of brutal by means of their culture? Yes, but it also scared people and it made people want to submit and not want to fight them. The Mongols were similar in that the horrific things they did made people want to surrender more readily. And it was kind of an image that they personally cultivated. I remember there were some tribes in Africa that like filed their teeth into to look sharp because it terrified Europeans. And Amerindians in North America, from my understanding, started to play off of the fear that the white man had of them and deliberately started to kind of play to that. So I think that's like the first thing, that fear, terror, and wanting to seem savage and wanting to seem brutal is something that's been there for all of human history. The Assyrians did it, the Aztecs did it, the Chinese did it. Everybody's done it. And for Westerners to have an impression that in a lot of cases I think was deliberately fostered is kind of foolish. So that's kind of point one. So the other thing that's often seen is decadence. And that's seen as just kind of a racist thing Westerners came up with. But where did they get this idea from? Where did they get this idea that the sultans lived in luxury, that Chinese emperors lived in luxury, that this was kind of part of it? And once again, this is a deliberately cultivated image. Something that a lot of these kings wanted to do was to show that they were, to some extent, divine. Even if they were in a monotheistic faith, that they were special, that they were chosen by heaven. And they wanted to make a certain remoteness and a certain almost otherworldly air to themselves, in contrast to kind of the average person within their societies. And once again, a lot of these things that we associate with decadence are status symbols. Having dozens of women shows how powerful you are. Having like these multiple massive palaces, all this expensive stuff, it's a way of creating a sense of awe and trying to keep your subjects in line. And we do see this all the time in Europe, though not to the same extent. You see stuff like Versailles. You see the various palaces they built in Russia, great works of art, statues, patronizing the sciences. This is something that all nobles do. It's just in the East, because the class structure was very different, in which cases you often would have a absolute monarch and then the peasantry, and there wasn't really as big a middle or upper middle class. Like if you look at how it worked in the Islamic world, fiefdoms, as we understand them in the West, were not very common. It tended to be more in the form of tax farming, where the Sultan would give the right to collect taxes in a certain period. It wouldn't kind of be the personal property of the feudal lord. They'd say, okay, you have this area, you can collect taxes from it, and you use that for kind of a similar purpose to European knights, to equip yourself and to equip a certain number of men-at-arms. Japan also worked in a similar way, at least theoretically, as did, China's kind of very different from the rest of the world. But that was often how it kind of went. And you often wouldn't really have, aside from the royal family, a dynasty that would control a piece of land for a very long period of time. Like the Wittelsbachs controlled Bavaria for an extremely long period of time. Even though they were often vassals of the Holy Roman Empire and later the German Empire, there was an understanding that independent of the monarch who was in power at a higher level, that was kind of their personal fiefdom. And you don't get that within the Islamic world nearly as much. So I think what we see as kind of Oriental despotism is kind of a natural combination of there not being any sort of middle class. Or there is one, but not in kind of the same way there was in the West, not nearly as strong. And the nobility being much less relatively powerful. And oftentimes in the East you have more the Sultan or like the emperor or whatever would govern through a bureaucracy rather than a more kind of decentralized feudal model that you see develop in kind of the West. Japan obviously kind of being the exception, and I admit I don't know very much about what medieval India was like. That's something I'd like to learn more about. But you have that, and then the desire to impress. So, I mean, kind of imagine what would have happened in Europe if polygamy was legal. There wasn't any social stigma associated with it. And there was really no middle class. There was no middle class, and there was no real great nobles. Like, I guess the closest we got to this is when we were in the absolute monarch era. But even then, it was kind of restricted to a certain extent by kind of Christian civilizational values, and the fact that even if even if kind of the other classes of society were sidelined in favor of the monarch, it just never got to the same degree that you saw in the East. And Yeah, like it was to make the emperor's personage sacrosanct. It was to portray him as kind of a god, the son of heaven, the king of kings, something like that. So that's kind of my thoughts on the matter. That's why I think kind of the whole Orientalism thing kind of really falls short. It doesn't make a whole bunch of sense. Because I think it kind of ignores, it ironically kind of infantilizes these other countries and these other peoples, and it makes what I think is often a deliberate policy into just Westerners projecting it onto them. Maybe there certainly is an aspect of Western chauvinism, but there's also a large aspect of these cultures wanting to be seen a certain way by the outside world. Anyways, those are my thoughts on the matter. I hope you enjoyed the video. This is Argent, and I'll talk to everybody real soon.